be deleted in history is one of the scariest things that could happen to a human being. If we look at these four African faces, something that we can automatically tell is that some of them have already been defaced, removed from history in their full form. This is a scary thought, knowing that these people are a giant clue to not only how the ancient Egyptians looked like, but also how they lived and if they were exactly the same as how we are today in the 21st century. The scariest part about it is that the full lips and the eyes give away who they really were. But I remember there was an argument made by somebody in a video I made a long time ago that I only commented on very slightly as to spare the person of a long diatribe. I think that's the word.
Arab invaders, not the original Egyptians. This is probably one of the most common arguments, and it also makes the most sense. Much of the people of the MENA region are Muslim, speak Arabic, and look pretty similar to outsiders, so it makes sense that it was probably an Arab demographic that wiped out the indigenous population of Africa and replaced them, or whatever. But not what happened, and here's some reasons why. For one, the Arabs came in 641 AD, and do you know the population of the Arabs that first came? 4,000 to 6,000.
Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you probably know that the people of Egypt had multiple movements from the Middle East. And I'm not even talking about far back, starting from when the Muslims came. They had multiple invasions and multiple movements going in that direction, starting with people like the people who even knew Muhammad. So why is it that the thought is that only 4,000 people came about? Well, there's something called a mantra. A mantra is something that people keep repeating over and over again, and really after a while they just start believing it. And it's a self-soothing mechanism, but it's also a self-deluding mechanism. If you believe it, it's real, but it's not real. We have so many books, and you know how obsessed I am with reading the Islamic text, because of course one of the things about the Islamic text not only prove that there were black people in Egypt, but they prove that there were a whole bunch of black people in the Middle East. And so saying that the Middle East was this isolated place from Egypt at this time is one of the most ridiculous things that someone can say. Whether we're talking about Gaza, whether we're talking about Israel, whether we're talking about, I don't care, Syria, whether we're talking about Persia, everywhere, people were just scattered. Now, if we go back from this date, I make a point in this video, which I should probably play right now.
It's true that the Arabs invaded later, but when people say Arabs, what they generally mean is Middle East, since we're talking about race. And if you want to talk about when did the Middle East move into Egypt and take over, we have to deal with the Hyksos, the Libyans, the Assyrians, and the Persians. When these people took over, did they only bring 6,000 people?
Now, the funny part is almost anybody from the Middle East would probably be surprised to hear that people from Egypt, when it comes to history, don't regard themselves as Middle Eastern, but instead Egyptian, purely Egyptian. Especially since people from the Middle East know for a fact that people from Egypt come from the Middle East, even very recently. So why is it that they're trying to run away from their own history when we know that the Middle East has got such deep history? Deep, deep history. We're talking about people who, I mean, they probably are the only group in the world that rival the Egyptians. The only group in the world that people still look at like, yeah, probably earlier than the Egyptians. So why would people try to run away from this? Well, it's as simple as this. And I'm about to say it, but you're gonna have to go with me on this. I just watched a video by Mr. Beast where he went to Egypt. I watched a video 2 weeks ago that was about Egypt's antiquities and how they want to revive their tourism and stuff like that. And interestingly, I think it's just a tourism thing. For some reason, they think their tourism is going to dry up if people realize that the ancient Egyptians were black. And that kind of scares me because they must know something that we don't if they say that. By the way, the person who's on the screen, I want you to try your best to try not to see a black guy and tell me if you can do it. When I was in the fifth grade, I remember reading books about pirates and Vikings and all kinds of historical people like knights. But then it dawned on me that all these people were just violent men and they were written about rather than writing themselves. Where I saw great potential was ancient Egypt. They barely lionized their warriors. They cared far more about their religion, and they seemed to be magical in the way they represented themselves. At that age, I didn't think about the fact that Egypt was in Africa. I knew it intellectually, but I didn't think about it too deeply. It didn't help that whether I went to the internet, whether I watched television, or whether I read books, the portrayal of the ancient Egyptians was that they were no different from the Greeks. And I was perfectly comfortable with that for a while. It was only when, in the fifth grade, someone left a worksheet on my desk upside down. And I looked at it upside down and I started speculating about who it was. The thick lips, the big eyes, the broad nose, and the ears made me think, okay, it's history class, so it must be somebody from history. Whether it's, an American, whether it's an African, maybe even a Middle Eastern black person. Now, I was not interested in modern history, but clearly that's what we were about to do since we are about to discuss a black African, especially one that had been depicted. But suddenly, I looked at it and said, that looks very familiar to me. And then I thought, there's no way. For 10 seconds, I had convinced myself that this person was black without being prompted by anybody. I had never even heard of the idea that ancient Egyptians were black. But as I kept gazing, it kept seeming clearer and clearer and clearer. And I was starting to think, there's no way in hell I must have been seeing things. Again, I never really thought about race, and I didn't associate black Africans with the ancient world in any way, shape, or form. And suddenly, I had the greatest kingdom in the world looking back at me with an African face. Later, I went to a library and Googled who built the pyramids. Now, what came back was stranger than what I had ever imagined. This is not the real website that popped up, but the first website that popped up was how aliens built the pyramids. Suddenly, in my head, I thought, wait a minute. People think that aliens built the pyramids? And like any other smart person, I went down a rabbit hole of aliens instead of focusing on the truth for 1 year. A year later, I saw a movie. Though this movie had biblical implications, I didn't care because what it got incorrect was less important than what it got correct. Suddenly, I thought to myself, someone else sees it too. These people were depicting the ancient Egyptians as black people. And I thought to myself, there's no way in hell that I made that up if someone else sees it. I saw a BBC documentary where a BBC person, a director, was freaking out on the thought of the statues that he saw being black Africans. Then I went and read some books written by some what they used to call Afrocentric scholars, and I realized there was a line that I couldn't just claim everyone was black. But I realized that there was a lot of people who, at first, if you show them the statues of Egypt, they will say they're black. And then when they're fed the propaganda, they will go away from it, like I did. Then year after year, I kept skipping over and over and over and over, constantly reading the Wikipedia page change year after year after year, realizing that people do not exactly know the race of these people. I studied hard, looked at different points of view, and suddenly I realized that everybody knows who these people really are. And when I say everybody, I don't mean everybody of our time. The Middle Easterners who had lived an Islamic golden age said in their own books that they had colonized Egypt from the ancients and from the Greeks, and they had replaced the population of North Africa, these being their words. They even talk about overwhelming the population in books written by Ibn Battuta and others. Then, before that, you have the Greeks who wrote all kinds of texts about how the population of Africa was slightly changed because of a Greek influence, and Herodotus stating that the Ethiopians and the Egyptians were the same. Not only that, we had Europeans of later times, which, no matter who I read, even some of the most racist of them, just had this pre assumption that ancient Egyptians were black. It seemed like it was only later that all of this changed. At some point during the propaganda and the whitewashing, I started to notice that some scholars were alleging that even the Nubians were white. And when they couldn't get away with that because every other scholar just laughed at them, they turned them into Arabs, then partial Arabs, and then they went back to black, but saying they were slaves and their civilization meant nothing. Textbook to textbook, pamphlet to pamphlet, article to article, Wikipedia article to Wikipedia article, I saw this debate rage on for a very long time. And then one day, the Cleopatra documentary came out. And it was only then that I thought I should give my opinion, because they were painting people in a very bad way, especially the Egyptians. The Egyptian government was painting people in a bad light. And even jokes by Kevin Hart about ancient Egyptians being black were seen as violent or needed to be banned from their country. Now, you probably wonder why I don't just show my face. Well, I don't want to be banned from Egypt. And also, I don't want the internet, which is food for demons, to enter my life in reality. Anyway, that's basically how I came to the conclusion that ancient Egyptians were natives. So, where did they get this 4,000 number from? Well, they got it from Amir, a person, an army general who invaded Egypt with 4,000 people. They pick a single battle where the ancient Egyptians got conquered, and then they say that's the entirety of the wars that made Egypt cave in to the Middle Easterners. And so they say, oh, there was only 4,000 people who came in, and that's about it. That's everybody in Egypt today, no matter who they are. It's only 4,000 people who are foreign. But what hurts is that when they find African DNA, they say, oh, all of that comes from slavery in their hundreds of thousands. So 4,000 people enslaved 100,000, 200,000, a million people. It doesn't make any sense. If you've ever read any of the Islamic texts, Egypt was basically what they claim in the past, a crossroads. People would travel as far as Tunisia, and from Tunisia, they would travel as far as Baghdad and Persia and India. And on this way, some people would drop off in the greatest site on earth. In fact, there's a video of a professor talking about how the pyramids at the time were some of the most important sites to the Islamic people. Alchemy was one of the biggest practices at the time. People would come from everywhere to go study in Egypt. Like a lot of things in the history or in the context that is made by historians, a single date is chosen, a single person's opinion is taken, and then everybody runs with it.
Relationship, connection between Arabians and Egyptian. Therefore, when I talk about their interest after Islam, it didn't come from nowhere. There was an old, long tradition of close relationship between Egypt and its neighbors. The other important thing I was an undergraduate wondering about is if all these Western travelers came and they took interest in the pyramids, for example, even though they didn't know what the function of the pyramid was, when the Arabs came in the 7th century formally in an army, the Islamic army, and they opened Egypt to Islam and the Egyptian converted gradually to Islam, why don't we refer to any interest on the part of these Arabs and the Muslim scholars from the 7th century onwards in ancient Egyptian monuments? Were they blind? They would go around, they would look at the Nile, they would look at huge pyramids like this, temples. The temples in Egypt are vast. Look at this temple of Karnak in Luxor. It covers 200 faddans or something. And look at this temple in Luxor of the Queen Hatshepsut. The Arabs had very good eyes. They could see around them, wandering around the Nile eyes, but these monuments, like everybody else. And they must have, if you are a scholarly person, you'd wonder, how did they build this pyramid? What did they do this temple for? What was the function of the pyramid?
He continues to talk about Egypt, of the scholars from the Islamic Golden Age who took an interest in Egypt.
The other thing is, he said, he gave examples of professors in Morocco who said one of their students came to pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. And of course, if you come from Morocco, you have to go through Egypt. And he came back home, and the professor said to him in the classroom, welcome back. Tell us about the pyramids of Egypt. And the student, pyramids of Egypt? I didn't go for the pyramids, I went for pilgrimage. And the teacher was really enraged and kind of almost wanted to kill him. He said, you passed by Egypt, and you were only a few feet away from the pyramids, and you did not go to look and study them. أخسئ بهمة طالب علم. This is a word he used in Arabic. What a terrible shame on a student like you to pass by the pyramids and doesn't stop there and study them and come back and give us a report about them. Now, this is a teacher of mathematics, by the way. So it's quite remarkable how these scholars viewed the study of ancient culture, study ancient Egypt, as a vital thing, as a must thing to do. But this is one of the most important things in the book. Somebody complained that, he said, Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, the great scholar referred to, Al-Idrisi said, Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi complained or said that Quran does not mention the pyramids. He said that in this book. And Al-Idrisi then says this fantastic page. He says, the holy books were sent to human beings not as textbooks of history and archaeology, but as books to guide people to do better and put them on the straight road of God. Now, think of that. This is a very important concept, because here in the West, you know how archaeology started in the West? Mainly to validate what the Bible says.